All right, good morning. Welcome to my talk, developing highly evasive malware techniques for bypassing modern AV and EDR solutions. We're going to start off with an agenda here. I'm going to give you a brief introduction about myself. We're going to talk about some choices in malware development, things that you want to consider before embarking. My approach to malware development, security controls and bypasses in any sort of target environment, some evasion techniques. I'm going to show you some video results and a demo of a shellcode-loader that I had built in the last year. And I'm going to give some insight into defenses and my future interests. Just want to shamelessly plug my GitHub real quick. My slides are available on my GitHub, and also some cool, fun tools. So, who am I? My name is Max Covey. I go by Lone Sir on the internet, sometimes. I'm a penetration tester for Acclaimed Technical Services, otherwise known as ATS. We're based out of Northern Virginia. I've got 5 years of IT experience, and the last 4 has been dedicated strictly to cyber. I'm a malware enjoyer. I'm also an aspiring offensive tool and exploit developer. And also, fun fact about me, I'm a night vision enthusiast. It's like my favorite hobby. Just a disclaimer before we get started in any of this. This presentation is for educational purposes only. The techniques that I'm going to be discussing should not be used for any malicious activity. Writing and distributing malware is illegal. And can lead to some severe legal consequences. Always follow ethical hacking practices and obtain written permission before engaging with any target. So, why I got into writing malware. So, I wanted to have a general idea, or I wanted to have a better understanding of how stealthy malware works. I see it all the time in news where some big company, some big bank, something gets hit by a new strain of stealthy malware, and EDRs didn't detect it, antivirus didn't detect it, it's got no signatures, all this sort of stuff. And I wanted to understand why that keeps happening. I wanted to sort of demystify how antivirus and endpoint detection and response systems actually operated. And I wanted to learn how to code in C. I just wanted to get better at that, as well as have a greater understanding of how low-level programming works for the purposes of offensive tool development. And I figured this would be a great new fun challenge and a passion project to undertake. So yeah, that's some of the reasons why I got into writing. So now we're going to get into some choices in malware development. These are things that you want to consider before you embark on and start on writing malware. So first we're going to talk about choosing a target. So when you first start out, it's a good idea to have a general idea of what sort of system or platform you want to target and what sort of security mechanisms are in place. You can target a ton of different things. So examples, you can target operating systems such as Windows, Linux, Mac OS, mobile OSs like Android and iOS. Several different architectures like x86, 64, which is all your Intel processors, ARM, which is your AMD processors, and MIPS, which is a IoT architecture. You can also have your malware target several different things like software. So you can have your malware infect browsers, Office suites such as Microsoft Office, LibreOffice, all those sorts of things, as well as integrated development environments such as IDEs. This is pretty useful if you're trying to target developers, especially if you have a payload that destroys IDEs or whatever you want it to do. But this is by no means an encompassing list. You can have malware that targets network-based stuff, cloud stuff, and UEFIs, like very low-level stuff. You're also going to want to choose a programming language that will be the easiest for you to use to accomplish your goal. So most malware is programmed in C and C++, but depending on your environment, depending on your target, depending on your payload, you may want to switch to something else. And depending also on your previous knowledge of programming language, like you can write it in C#, Bash, PowerShell, Go, Rust, x86 assembly if that's, well, x86 64 assembly if that's your vibe. And also, I've been seeing more malware recently being written in NIM, which is pretty cool. So some of the, I have some tables on the right here that show basically market shares of operating systems and versions of operating systems. So in the top right here, it's marked with the number 1. This is a global market share of operating systems. You can see the top orange line is Android, which is a mobile operating system. I'm not going to be too worried about that for this talk. I'm more going to be focused on Microsoft Windows, which is the blue line, which has a considerable market share over any sort of other desktop operating systems. Like it's kind of in the lead by a really large margin. You can see OS X and Linux below it. Down on the second picture here, we have a what versions of Windows are currently being circulated and what sort of market share they have. So we have the purple line, which is Windows 10. This is by far the most popular still, even after the release of Windows 11. We can see that in the bottom grayish blue line. And funny enough, the yellow line is still Windows 7. I don't know who that is, but you should probably stop. I figured it would be someone here. So next we're going to move on to picking a payload. So picking a payload is super important because this is going to be what your malware actually performs. Like this is the action that it does. Payloads can trigger exploits, they can start and stop processes, establish command and control to different servers, manipulating files such as watermarking, encrypting them or otherwise obfuscating them. As well as it can survey the environment and then download additional payloads. Most payloads are going to be represented as shellcode, which is a form of position-independent series of bytes, I guess, that can execute properly wherever it's loaded in into memory. The last thing you want is for your payload to get loaded and it doesn't work. So this is why we use position-independent code. There are a ton of different ways that you can make shellcode, but by far the most popular way is using MSF Venom, but you can always write your shellcode by hand if you choose to, if you're particularly hardcore and you want some optimal evasion. Over on the right here, I've got a picture of my favorite payload. This just runs calculator. When you're first starting out, it's probably, I have found it to be the best to use a payload that you can get instant recognition when it executes. So when you're working on process injection, if stuff fails, you'll know right off the bat that stuff has failed. So using calculator, when you use this payload, it just launches calculator and you can immediately see it. So you know that it worked. Sorry, am I still centered on the mic? Sorry. Next, we're going to talk about choosing a execution flow and delivery method. So first off, we're going to start off with choosing an execution flow. So there are many different ways that you can execute your malware. There's staged lists, beaconing object files, and macros. For staged, what staged is it's usually a 2 or 3 part executable where the first part is goes and reaches out and grabs an additional part of your payload. Say if you have a dropper and you need additional functionality once it's been deployed, or if you've got OPSEC concerns and you don't want to bring your full payload over until you're absolutely sure you've got initial access, that could be a reason for you to use staged. Stageless is bringing everything over all at once. This is pretty great. This is my preferred method. because you don't have to worry about any sort of outbound networking rules or firewalls that would prevent it because you bring everything over, so there's no reason to reach out anywhere. Beaconing object files are a little bit of half and half between the two, where it's staged, it's stageless in the fact that everything comes over all at once. However, parts of the executable are encrypted. And they are only decrypted when you call upon that functionality. And also, depending on the beaconing object file you use, it can also reach out and download more payloads, which makes it more of a staged payload. You can also have macros, which is just a way of embedding code into a Microsoft Office file, like Word or PowerPoint. Then we have, we're going to talk about some evasion stuff. So when we're talking about building malware, we want to be cognizant of how our evasion techniques are going to go right off the bat so that we make sure that we can accommodate for them. So we need to be paying attention to if we're going to be doing any sort of execution delays for sandbox evasion. We'll talk about that later in the presentation. Payload obfuscation. We need to be able to realize and recognize where our payloads are actually going to be in their sort of final form, where they're decrypted and usable, or unobfuscated and in a usable form. Also, conditional execution is something to pay attention to. Say if you're geofencing your malware, or you only want your malware to be executed by a target user, that would be something that you'd want to sort of plan out ahead of time, because it's not the easiest thing to do when you're done. Also, we need to be aware of some requirements for our target system. We need to realize, are we going to put our malware on disk, or is it going to be completely memory resident, which is also really cool, by the way. We need to know if internet access is going to be necessary. Like I mentioned, if you have a staged payload, it's going to need to reach out somewhere to grab the rest of it outside of just your regular C2 traffic or whatever you want to do. We need to know if external libraries are required. So these are going to be things like the C runtime library, where if your malware lands on a target and they don't have it installed, your malware is not going to work. So we need to sort of plan this out ahead of time. If the target has limited resources and processing space, so you don't want your malware to get deployed on some place where they don't have enough space on disk to download it, or if you have a piece of malware that's running on a really crappy system, you don't want to accidentally nuke your target just because it's overloaded with your malware. So for delivery methods, you have a lot. There's nearly an infinite of ways that you can deliver your malware to target. I think most popular is phishing. This is just where you send a malicious file and get someone to download it via email. You can also do drive-by downloads, which are when you navigate to a website and it automatically downloads in your browser, or you have or you're doing some sort of malvertising and stuff gets downloaded that way. Backdooring software is also a very common way of distributing malware. These are your sort of Trojans. So say if you're doing patching or doing an update or issuing your own updates or issuing even your own executables for things, you can always backdoor them so that when they get executed on your targets, it will launch your payload. Removable media, this is the fun one. These are things like using a DVD, bad USB, these things to physically go up into a computer, plug it in, and that will execute your payload. Next is your hardware and firmware implants. These are things like, this is relatively hard to execute, and I guess you got to be pretty bougie to have this all planned out. But basically, if you have a target that you know is going to be is going to be buying some hardware, if you know their supply chain, you can get into it and you can put in malicious hardware or write malicious firmware to that hardware. Pagers. Like pagers. this is a form of supply chain compromise. Also, compromised libraries and repositories. This is another form of supply chain compromise. This is like pretty popular with different sorts of groups. This is where you compromise a GitHub repository or some other code repository where software is being built from, and when you commit your malicious code to these repositories, when they're picked up, you will have code execution, or you'll have your payload be executed once it's compiled and executed. Lastly, you have exploits. These are like super fun, but this is just a software vulnerability where you can just it's a vulnerable service or software that you can get to just execute your payload without much of, not necessarily much user interaction, but it's an exploit. We know what exploits are. For example, WannaCry was transferred using the external blue exploit. So here's my approach. So here are my choices in malware development. I was overwhelmed with all the choices, so I wanted to go with something more general. So I decided to do a shellcode-loader. I wanted to have it be a modular design, so I could add and remove modules if I needed as I learned. I wanted to target Windows 10, but easily be able to upgrade it to Windows 11 when that becomes more popular, maybe. And I wanted to have it be written in C and C++, or C or C++. And I was going to plan to deliver it via phishing and have it stored on disk. I also wanted to have it be stageless to minimize opportunities for failure while I was testing. And most importantly, I wanted it to be super, super sneaky. Because who doesn't want their malware to be super sneaky? So now I'm going to give you guys a super ultra crash course per se in Windows internal, so we could better understand sort of the controls that we're going up against. Once again, my malware was written for Windows. Even though these techniques do apply, I'm going to be mainly talking about Windows 10 here. So Windows is comprised of dynamic link libraries, or otherwise known as DLLs, that export functionality for other users, for other applications to use. NTDLL.dll is by far the most important DLL because it facilitates communication with the Windows kernel and provides necessary context and syntax needed to issue system calls into the kernel. The Windows operating system operates with a privilege hierarchy, often referred to as rings. We can see the graphic up there. User mode is ring 3. This is where all your applications sit, and they usually run with limited privileges. There's also, level 2 and 1, but for the purposes of this talk, we're just going to talk about ring 3 and ring 0. So kernel mode, also known as ring 0, has basically full control over system hardware. It can manipulate it. This has the most privileges. So when an application in ring 3 needs to perform a task, Windows APIs are translated using various DLLs into native APIs, and then finally down into system calls into kernel mode, where that task can be allotted CPU cycles and then actually be executed. On the right here, we have a lovely little diagram that shows sort of an execution flow, I'll say, of how Windows APIs are translated into NTAPIs and then into syscalls. So up top here, say if you're using notepad.exe and you want to create a file that's saved to disk, it's going to call create file W, which is just the wide version of that. And that function is exported from kernel32.dll. Then it is passed down to kernel-base.dll, and then it is converted in ntdll.dll into ntcreate file. And then a syscall occurs, which is then puts our execution flow into kernel mode, where it can actually be allotted CPU cycles and then executed. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding security controls and their bypasses. So this is how most antivirus works. Antivirus usually detects malicious files based off of signature-based detections. These are things like hashes, unknown, common strings. Yeah, common strings. They also have behavioral monitoring. So, say if your malware is writing to some sort of sensitive file, it may be able to manipulate that. Sorry, not manipulate that, alert on that. So say if you're, I don't know, say if explorer.exe is writing to the registry or Notepad is writing to the registry, it might throw that up. Also, you have your heuristic flags. These are things, these are very similar to EDRs. I've not actually seen this to be very common, but basically they act as EDRs where they monitor APIs as they go down into the kernel. Basically effectively acting as a EDR. And basically what AVC are file signatures, unusual actions, and network traffic. And so it will, if it finds any of these things that it deems to be malicious, it will quarantine the file or just straight up delete it. So endpoint detection system, endpoint detect and respond systems, how these work. So it's like AV, but it's better in almost every single way. And especially if you're in a enterprise environment, EDRs are definitely the way to go because you have agents that can give you great diagnostics about your system, and you can maintain it relatively easily. EDRs detect malicious activity by doing behavior analysis on API hooks. So these are things you can see here in the bottom red square. This is where your EDR is going to be sitting and intercepting syscalls as they enter the kernel. Like I said, they intercept syscall instructions, and they also do stack tracing. So this is a relatively, I don't want to say new technology, but some of the larger, more popular EDRs are adopting them. Basically, it just keeps track of all your stack information and all the DLLs that are exporting your functions to make sure everything checks out. Oh, it also cross-references ntdll.dll to identify your syscall information. And we'll talk about syscalls more in depth in a minute. So now we're going to get into some evasion techniques. These are some of the things that I've used, that I've worked on, that I've implemented, that have been the most effective at evading antivirus solutions. So first, we're going to start off with process injection. This is the quintessential technique for bypassing AVs and EDRs and sandboxes. This has been done for like ever. Process injection is a technique where by manipulating a target's process's memory or threads, it can deviate from its standard execution flow and be redirected to where our payload is. There's a ton of different ways that you can perform process injection. We have DLL injections, portable executable injections, thread hijacking, mapping injections, asynchronous procedural calls, otherwise known as APC injections, and process hollowing. We're going to talk about a few of these in the upcoming slides, not all of them though, sorry. I didn't have enough time. I just wanted to highlight one of these, a process injected notepad.exe in the bottom right picture here. We can see that my notepad.exe has an open port and it is reaching out to my C2 server. So that's sort of what it looks like. Obviously you would obfuscate that, but I just thought it was pretty funny to show. So there's a few ways, so I'm going to talk about 3 ways of process injection. First off, we're going to start with a classic sort of injection. Basically how this works is you use APIs like open process to open a handle to the target process, virtual alloc ex to allocate memory to that process, and then we're going to write our payload to that process's memory space. And then we're going to execute it with create remote thread. And these are super commonly used APIs, and they're widely detected, so I wouldn't recommend using this for on-disk sort of malware. funny enough, this is a snippet from a tool called PowerMove, which is a fileless process injector, so nothing ever touches the disk, so I don't have to worry about antivirus or anything like that, although it will not bypass, or I highly suspect that it will not bypass EDR solutions. The reason why I bring this up is because it's blue because it's written in PowerShell. I just wanted to overlay the fact that you don't actually have to write everything in C or assembly or anything like that. Once again, I actually wrote this tool in PowerShell. It's available on my GitHub. Next is a technique called mapping injection. Basically how this works is you use create file mapping to create a mapping of memory, and then you map the view of a file, which is another API that allows you to write a payload to a target map or section, and then you map that section into the target process's memory, and then it'll get executed. And lastly, we have APC injection. This one's a fun one because you use sort of common APIs like virtual alloc and virtual protect and queue user APC to basically queue your payload instructions to an alerting thread, and an alerting thread is just a thread of a target process that has had its queue been emptied or has just been suspended in any sort of other way. And when you, what's it called? When you queue this, when you queue a thread, when that thread is resumed, it will execute your code. So this is my favorite type of process injection. This is what I use in my own loader. It is super awesome. And I found it on accident when I was going through some of the Maldev Academy content. But so we have, it's pseudo threadless process injection via function stomping. And this exploits a fundamental flaw in the Windows operating system. So DLLs, like we spoke about earlier, are shared across multiple different processes. And the DLL base address is likely going to be different due to an exploit prevention mechanism called address space layout randomization, or ASLR. But the exported DLL functions of those DLLs share the same address across processes. So if we can find the target function's address, we can override it with our shellcode and redirect the execution flow. You can trigger payload execution by calling create remote thread, or most importantly, or by overriding a function that is called by the target process during its regular execution flow. This technique bypasses process isolation because you shouldn't be able to do this. Obviously, you need some level of privilege to actually be able to overwrite ntdll.dll or any of the other DLLs. Sorry, you're not overwriting ntdll.dll. For this one, I was overwriting user32.dll. But basically, it bypasses process isolation and data execution prevention, which is also another sort of exploit prevention mechanism employed by Windows. And it doesn't create any new threads because all of the function is being called by your target process, which means you get to have one less EDR monitor event where you're creating a thread to execute your payload. On the right here, I've got a picture of me looking at notepad.exe. I was debugging notepad.exe using x64 debugger. And you can see here that I've got, I know it's kind of small, that's why I referenced the GitHub earlier. But you can look at the symbols allotted to your to the target process, such as user32.dll, and we can see here on the very far right, you have translate message, which is a function that it calls, and so as well as the address for that function. So that's where we're going to be targeting. So moving on to the next one, we have payload encryption. This utilizing payload encryption exploits a design flaw in antivirus by modifying the representation of how your payload is represented while it's sitting on disk, which bypasses signature-based detection because it is likely going to be different than anything else that you've seen. that the AVs have seen. There's a lot of encryption algorithms or otherwise obfuscation algorithms that you can use, but some really easy ones are the XOR, RC4, and AES. I really like RC4 the best because it can be implemented really quickly in like 3 functions. It's not the most cryptographically secure algorithm out there. If you're trying to do that, I'd recommend using something like AES and some very secure keys. But for my purposes and just evading signature detection, using RC4 was the way to go. Make sure if you're building a stageless payload that you obfuscate or encrypt your keys and then transform those keys at runtime to avoid any reverse engineers from being able to dump your keys without detonating your executable first. This is huge because forcing an analyst to execute our payloads gives us an opportunity to modify our executable's behavior as it is being analyzed. This can be done using a bunch of anti-analysis techniques such as anti-VM, anti-sandboxing, hashed blacklisting, so blacklisting any sort of debugger, any sort of that so it won't execute in the normal way, as well as self-deletion. So next technique I'm going to talk about is execution delays, and using an execution delay helps bypass sandbox environments by effectively buffering the malicious activity outside of the analysis window that sandboxes usually operate in. So most online sandboxes only monitor executables between 3 and 5 minutes. So basically, if we can get all of our malicious activity out of that 3 to 5 minutes, we're pretty much in the clear in terms of sandboxes. So there's a few ways of doing this. Oh, there's a ton of ways to do this. What am I saying? But one of the easiest one is just using the sleep win API, which just sleeps your file and nothing happens. And then when the timer is done, it's good to go. Also, sleep hammering is a technique where you basically run a bunch of nonsense APIs to make it look like your process is doing something. It's got CPU cycles going, all these sorts of things. And you may be asking, why would we want to do this? It feels like it's using up a bunch of additional memory that it doesn't have to. Well, we need to be cognizant of some sandboxes that have the ability to analyze our process during these delays, and it can alert on when a process is not doing much of anything. So obfuscating your delay method may be necessary. On the right here, I've got one of my favorite projects, the Unprotect project. Basically, it's a huge catalog of malware development techniques and red team tool developing techniques. I know the text is a little small, but I just wanted to show you the sheer amount of techniques that are available for you to use, and this is all free. I'll have it referenced at the end. It's a good idea that when you're implementing these sandbox delays, execution delays, or any sort of delays really, it's important to implement fast forward detectors that are able to sense when an analyst is manipulating system time to bypass your delay. Basically, all you do is you put in a get system time API at the beginning of your delay and then at the end of the delay, and then after the allotted time you do a calculation, and if the system times are not equivalent to the actual time that you specified, you can alert and you can change how your malware executes because there has been a manipulation in system time. So next, bear with me here. It's going to get a little complicated. I'm going to do the best to make it not that complicated. So next is syscalls. So system calls, or otherwise known as syscalls, is one of the most stealthy and most privileged ways of executing your code. And it allows you to bypass all userland controls and hooks. Basically, I just want you guys to remember these 3 things. So the first one is syscalls have a syscall number. This is a number relating to in NTDLL, or I guess technically in the kernel, that relates to functionality. Then we have a syscall instruction, which is the instruction itself that drops you from user mode into kernel mode. And then I want you guys to also remember the syscall address. That's not really pointed at on this picture, I'm sorry. But basically it is just the address of that syscall in memory. It's the address of that syscall instruction in memory. So all of your functions have these things. All of your syscalls have a syscall number, address, all these things. Syscall numbers are often different across different versions of Windows, so be sure to use the correct syscall numbers for your target's kernel. Once again, we don't want our payload to not be executed. And there's several different ways, or there's two major ways of identifying syscalls. So one is to read the Windows x86-64 system call table that I will have referenced at the end, but it's a dry read, guys. It's really dry. And next is to parse a live copy of ntdll.dll. This is by far my favorite method because you don't have to worry about doing any sort of lookups online or having to do any guesswork, because when you parse ntdll.dll on your target, everything is going to be dynamically resolved. So there's two types of syscalls. We have direct syscalls and indirect syscalls. The first one we're going to talk about is direct syscalls. So this is where you, in your program, you manually reconstruct the syscall syntax without the need of ntdll.dll. This calls the syscall instruction directly from your executable. And this also bypasses all userland hooks, as we can call the function we need directly from the kernel. We have a lovely graph here on the left where it shows the flow from our evil.exe all the way down to syscall and into the kernel. Indirect syscalls are built in a similar way, but instead of having a syscall instruction, it's a jump instruction where you jump the execution flow from your syscall that you would have normally allotted to a different syscall, but more importantly, a legitimate benign syscall. So when EDRs see that, they just go, oh, he's calling, I don't know, get process info, I don't know, something like that. This is really the key part here, is that it goes through ntdll.dll, but not kernel32.dll or any of the other intermediary DLLs. It makes it a little bit more stealthy. It looks a little bit more legit, but it does fall short sometimes on stack tracing EDRs. So these are three methods for doing syscalls. We have Hell's Gate, syswhispers, and Hell's Hall. These are all different methods. They're publicly available and most importantly free. Hell's Hall Public is once again publicly available, but it has the private version is available on Maldev Academy. Highly recommend it. Basically, you have Hell's Gate, which is it runs direct syscalls and it can identify them dynamically. We have syswhispers 3, which is also direct and dynamically identified syscalls, and Hell's Hall, which is indirect, so it has that jump instruction as well as dynamic identification. So next, unfortunately, I do not have a POC for this, so I cannot truly speak to it, but I feel like I'd be doing you guys a disservice if I didn't talk about it. So custom call stacks is a technique by, I'm going to butcher this, Chedin Nyack, the Brute Rattel C4 author, to combat really the hard-hitting EDRs like Sentinel-1 and CrowdStrike Falcon that perform really intense call stack tracing. It uses asynchronous and proxy DLL loading to maintain a clean call stack while calling suspicious APIs. It's better than stack spoofing because the stack can be unwound fully without crashing or leading to any read execute memory sections, which could be an EDR alerted event or an EDR alerted location. He's got a super detailed write-up on this technique, and it's really promising. Also, I wanted to mention that this technique came out last year, but it is very promising, and I've seen quite a bit of people using it. Next, we're going to talk about getting rid of some of the indicators on your files themselves. your executables themselves. So we're going to first start off with IAT manipulation. So the import address table, or otherwise known as the IAT, is a part of the portable executable format that is used to dynamically resolve addresses to external functions and libraries. It contains all of the APIs that you've used in your program, and it's used by AVs and EDRs to identify suspicious APIs and potentially dangerous API combinations and prevent execution of that file. There's several different methods that you can use to remove APIs from the IAT, such as API hashing, manual API resolution, and inline assembly. We're going to talk about API hashing on the next page, or on the next slide. It is important to note that you can add false APIs to your import address table by implementing impossible conditions to your code and tricking the compiler into thinking that APIs are actually being used when they're not. So on the left here we have some code that basically creates a impossible condition, a pointer-based impossible condition that is not properly evaluated by the compiler, and therefore it adds all of these APIs to the IAT. Next, like I just mentioned, we're going to talk about API hashing. So API hashing is what enables you to call APIs via a function pointer, but via a pointer. This enables you to obfuscate your APIs by representing them as hashes. This sort of abstraction removes the suspicious APIs from the import address table, and depending on your hashing function and how you obfuscate your hashing function, it can make it incredibly, incredibly difficult for a reverse engineer to identify the original APIs. This is a method for achieving polymorphism, so making sure that all of your APIs and all of your hashes are different every time your malware is compiled can make it really difficult for identifying for signature-based antiviruses to identify your malware. This is super important because it also hides strings and allows you to proxy your functions. And for best results, do your API hashing at compile time with a random seed. On this picture here up in the top left, we have the APIs that we're going to be using and the hashing function, and it outputs all of your the function names into this basically the pseudo-random random string of numbers and letters that are represented in hex. Then we move those hashes into our deployment phase, into our actual executable, where we use a searching function that triggers a hashing function on ntdll.dll, where we hash all of the functions, and then we compare our hashes to the hashes of the hashed ntdll.dll. And then some output here is you'd get like, oh, this hash is equal to NT open process at memory location, and then you can call your function and point your arguments to that direction. It's very similar to password hashing. Next is CRT list executables. So removing the C runtime library, otherwise known as the CRT, gets rid of any unnecessary functions gets rid of any unnecessary functions from your executables and makes them significantly smaller and can evade some EDRs. It also enables your payload to run on systems that do not have the CRT already installed. There are a few ways to do this, but it can be done pretty simply in Visual Studio, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. Macros here are your friend. Just some words of warning. Doing this is going to likely give you a lot of errors because if you're using functions that are exported by the C runtime library, you're going to have to either rewrite them or use reverse engineered ones or using rewritten official ones, the versions of your functions, so that you can actually use that functionality in your malware. But also, it takes a little while to do, but once you're done, you'll have the super minimalist CRT independent library for you to use in all of your future projects. So you really only have to do it once if you get it working properly. Also, using VX Underground's VX API is an awesome resource for finding these alternative functions. Also, I just highly recommend VX API because they're badass. On the left here, we have this is the import address table. You can see here on the left the before and after. On the before, we have all these tons of extra functions and unused functionality, and then on the right, we have the super, super sleek and streamlined APIs that we're actually going to be using, and from here you would add your false APIs to hide, to more sort of obfuscate your legitimate ones. To remove the CRT, it's super simple. So we can switch to release x64. Sorry, this is all in Visual Studio, by the way. So switching to release x64, enabling multi-threading, disabling C++ exemptions, disabling whole program optimization, disabling debug information, disable manifest generation, set an entry point to main, so your execution flow knows where to go, and disable security checks, disable SDL checks, and then most importantly, ignore all default libraries. I like to call this phase the turning working code into not that phase. As you can see here at the before picture, we've got perfectly working code, no issues found, and then after we have all these errors, and yeah. So here's some general tips. So these are some general tips about making malware and just, some life tips in general, I guess. So first off is hide your process window. We don't want any sort of target to be wondering what happened, what just flashed on screen. Keep suspicious strings out of your executables. I mean, this is how things get signatured if you're not hashing them or doing any sort of polymorphism. Never use read, write, and execute memory regions, and try to minimize using read, execute regions that are user allocated, because this is a EDR. Depending on the EDR you're going up against, this may be an EDR monitored location. Be cognizant of your file's entropy. So entropy is the randomness of your file. So malware has a very distinct sort of entropy identifier. So when malwares often use packers, encryption, obfuscation, things that make your file appear to be more random than it actually is, or sorry, more random than a regular file. So we got to be cognizant that we're not utilizing encryption so much that it looks majority random and gets alerted by that. Removing unnecessary and unused functionality. Most of the time, the smaller the executables, the better. Also, opt for runtime runtime computations instead of using multiple setup executables. So, like, say for instance, API hashing and encryption can be done at compilation time, which is a lot better. Also, sign your executables. It just helps bypass Smart Screen on Windows. Also, don't submit your executables to VirusTotal or other cloud-based detection engines until you're absolutely positive that you have a sort of polymorphism or polymorphic solution in place. Because the last thing you want is to submit your project and then it just gets detected from the get-go. Emphasize proxying all of your actions through various DLLs and asynchronous things if performance isn't really an issue on your target. And value your OPSEC at all times. And lastly, just make sure you test. I can't make this enough. Test your methods before you use them in a real life situation, especially on a red team engagement. I will not be held responsible because you decided to use some of these techniques just because someone at JawnCon told you that they worked. and then you blow your cover. I will not be hearing that out. So here's some results. So this is a shellcode loader that I made called terp. I just like it because it has a funny name. It's a custom-built shellcode loader that was written in C and x86 64 assembly. It's currently in v0.1, and it runs any shellcode. It has a customizable target for process injection. It has a modular design, and it has you can enable and disable the interface, and it's only 16.5 kilobytes in size after removing the CRT. I used a few techniques such as API hashing to achieve my polymorphism. my pseudo threadless process injection via indirect syscalls using the household private version, once again available at the Maldev Academy. I removed the CRT, and I removed most of the suspicious strings. There was still a few that I couldn't get out, like user32.dll, that string, and translate message I couldn't get out. But there's ways to do that. I just ran out of time. This is my solution for payload encryption. Basically, it's an external program, which I know I just told you guys not to use external programs to do your stuff, but I was learning. Sue me. And so basically, you give it some shellcode, and it encrypts your shellcode using RC4, and it prints all the variables that you need to easily, it prints all the variables needed to easily self-brute force the encryption keys at runtime, and it uses an easy sort of copy and paste output so that you can easily copy your payloads and all your variables into the loader and then send it off. Here's the execution flow. We have of TerpLoader. So it's basically broken down into 3 phases. We have our setup, delivery, and execution. So first in the setup, we generate a payload using MSF Venom. This could be a reverse shell, it could be anything. I like reverse shells, and I'm going to show you one on the next slide. Then we encrypt our payload that was just generated, and then we place the encrypted payload into our loader. And then I compile and configure my targets for in TerpLoader. And then I move on to the delivery phase. So in this, you could fish a target or do whatever to get that executable to be downloaded by your target. And then it just gets downloaded to the disk. This specific loader is not really memory resident, so it has to be stored on disk. Then for the execution, TerpLoader is usually, will be launched. Then TerpLoader.exe hashes and parses ntdll.dll and populates a syscall table. And then it decrypts the payload. And then it performs the pseudo threadless process injection via indirect syscalls into the target process. And then the injected process then executes our payload, which is, that's where our profit is, because we're now outside of the purview of, depending on what you inject into, we may be outside of the purview of AVs and EDRs, especially if you're injecting into a Microsoft signed executable. And then TerpLoader self-terminates, so you don't got to worry about it. Moving on. So the next video is going to start right off the bat. It's a video demo of my loader going up against Windows 10 Pro on the latest update of 22H2 as of September. Oh, woo! Go back. There we go. Just gonna play. There we go. So here we go. We can see it's a Windows 10 Pro. It has all of the Windows Defender controls enabled, including cloud protection. Here's me downloading my payload. It's got an uncommon download warning, but this isn't really anything. It just says that your payload is, the executable is not commonly downloaded. Here I do a virus scan, no current threats. Here's me creating a target process. For this example, I use notepad.exe. Here's Smart Scan. This can be bypassed by signing your executables, and there we go. We get a shell. There's no alerts. The file doesn't get deleted or quarantined. And you can see here we've got command execution. There you go. Thank you. So next, I'm going to go over the virus total results. So unfortunately, I was only able to consistently get about 4 out of 73 or 74 detections for my payloads. I'd like to get lower, but I'm going to be completely honest here. I think some of these I can't verify this, may be false positives, but that just happen to be true. But we'll see. I mean, until I can prove it, it's a we're going to say that I got it down to 4, which is about 93% bypassing. In terms of AVs, these are all the AV sections. Yeah. So we have some detection and defense. So nothing will ever be fully undetectable forever. Slowly but surely, technology will advance to be able to detect modern evasion tactics. So as a malware developer, as red teamers, you got to stay vigilant to new techniques and methods to stay ahead of the defense if you're trying to stay under the radar. I recommend checking out the best EDR of the market. It's a little boutique EDR that's available for free on GitHub, and it's how you can test your payloads against EDRs to make sure none of the APIs are getting intercepted and hooked or anything like that. And I saw a DEF CON talk at DEF CON 32, the last one, and it was defeating EDR evading malware with memory forensics, and basically it was a write-up by the Velexity team about some new Votality plugins that were able to detect EDR evasive malware, things that were using Hell's Gate, indirect syscalls, and some hardware syscalls. Hardware break indirect syscalls. Here's some suggestions for defenders. Block and monitor unsigned executables if you can. Restrict downloads on your users. You don't want people just going and randomly downloading my file, would you? Having an allow list is pretty useful, so you make sure that only Microsoft executables are run. There's no chance for execution of non-Microsoft executables getting running, or non-allowed programs to get run. Also, update your AVs and EDRs regularly. I know I just sort of dunked on all the AVs and stuff, but they are useful. They do catch a lot of stuff. I know that to be the case because all of my stuff got detected really early on when I first started. Also, embrace new technologies. New EDRs come out all the time. New detection mechanisms, especially like I was talking about the Votality plugins. Embrace them. They're really good. They work, and they are quite literally the bleeding edge. Also, educate users on the dangers of malware and how it can actually impact your business, and conduct phishing campaigns to really sort of let them know that they are not immune. Here's some useful resources. I just wanted to highly recommend MalDev Academy. This is where I learned a lot of stuff. I recommend taking a picture of this because it's got a lot of everything. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So here's where to go from here. These are some of my future interests, just some things that I think are interesting. One, I wanted to get a custom call stack POC for you guys, but like I said, I just couldn't get it working in time. VM obfuscation, things like Themata, which basically use custom CPU architectures to evade analysis, are pretty cool. I wanted to look more into persistence mechanisms, firmware implants, and cloud resident malware. And here are my resources. Oh, sorry, here are my references. Haha, no, I'm joking. Here we go. And thank you. I wanted to thank everybody at JawnCon for letting me speak, and thank you guys for listening to my talk. These are all my links. Yeah. I'll be around for the rest of the day, and you can contact me on any of these things, and I love talking about malware, so if you've got questions. Also, my LinkedIn. I'm trying to hit 500 connections. Whew, that is my talk. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? We have 1 minute. Does anybody have a super easy question, like a low ball? What's up?
So that notepad exploit, why is Microsoft allowing that to happen? Why was it patched? Is it because the address randomization is not robust?
Say that again.
That notepad exploit that you showed us, where you had notepad checking out. How come you can still do that?
I can only assume that screenshot was taken with Windows Defender enabled. I assume that it's just a Microsoft signed executable, so they don't give it as much analysis as some of the other non-Microsoft signed executables. Anyone else? All right, thank you.